So this morning, while your brains are bright and fresh, we start with closing the transaction, or as bright and fresh as you might get. It's a relative term, So, closing the transaction, chapter 21. This is, there's a lot of math in this chapter. Here's what I will tell you. And this is probably the only time you'll hear me say this about a math topic in here. You're either going to get it or you ain't with this subject. And I want you to get it because it's an important part of what you do as a real estate broker. At the same time, I do not want to have you get bogged down in it and spend 20 hours trying to figure it out. Because in my experience, as I said, you either get it or you don't with this one. And it's going to be one question on the exam. So you cannot afford to invest 20 hours worth of study time into one question. Especially since, like I said, you either get it or you don't with this topic. So here's what we're trying to do. Here's what we're attempting to do. And again, I don't want you to sit there and not ask questions. I do want you to ask questions. I just don't want you to beat yourself up if you're not getting it. The math of a closing statement is not hard. There's just a lot of it. There's like 15 to 18 moving pieces on any single one. And so people get lost. They get just overwhelmed by the number of calculations that are involved in something. Did you want your normal seat? I can move my jump.
No, it's fine.
You're
it's
good?
fine.
You're, okay, good. She doesn't like you. I mean, she actually pointed up here. She was like, I don't know what happened there, but you know, you've been marooned up here by yourself. Look at this. As the class goes on, look what happens. Y'all get ready. Like it's shrinking. It always shrinks to the back. Every real estate class I've ever taught works that way. So when we talk about closing the transaction, I don't want you to lose sight of what we're doing here. We are trying to calculate one important number. How much money does the buyer need to bring to the closing? Would you agree that that's an important number to know? Yeah. Absolutely. And the closing statement is the way that we get there. Now, you do get off easier than classes of the past. In the past, you had to know how to calculate, not only calculate, but create the closing statement. And the HUD-1 form. And those of you that have been to a real closing in your life and seen a HUD-1 form, that was the most intimidating thing ever for a pre-licensing student, to be able to fill that thing out. You guys don't have to do that anymore. You do, however, have to know how to do the math that it takes to get there. You're still expected to do the math that it takes to get there. But I actually think it's easier for you to learn the math without having the horror of the form in front of you. Because what happened with the form, it never failed. People got so hung up on what line things went on that they freaked out and forgot how to do the math. Here's what I've learned. Some people are OCD and there's nothing you can do to help it, right? You know, you just have, and so if there's a line there with a label on it, you can't possibly ignore that label. Because this is what I used to tell people. I used to tell you, and I see you out there, like some of you are out there like, yeah, that's me, right? You know, I mean, I used to tell people, just ignore the labels. Don't worry about what the label said. It doesn't matter. You can put it on any line you want to. And they would literally sit there for 30 minutes like, I don't know what line it goes. It doesn't matter. But that doesn't work. You know, you can't overcome it, and I get that. So the nice thing is now you don't have to worry about that any longer because they're not even going to give you a sheet. You can make your own. And when you make your own, guess what? It goes on any line you want it to. And so that gives people, I think, a little bit of a breather from the actual completion of the form. But I don't want you to lose sight of what you're doing. What you're doing is calculating how much money this buyer needs to show up with at closing. Now, here's why I have to say that in the beginning before we get involved with the math. People get so hung up on, well, I got to calculate the buyer's down payment. No, you don't. Because when you calculate the amount of money they bring to closing, guess what's included in that amount of money they bring to closing? Their down payment. They're like, oh, I have to calculate how much their closing costs are. No, you don't. Because when you calculate how much money they need to bring to closing, wouldn't you think their closing costs are included in that number? The great thing is, that number you're calculating includes everything. It's already taken into account how much of a loan they're getting and how much of a down payment they're making and how much they got to pay in property taxes and estimated interest and all of that stuff is boiled down to one number. So that you can tell that buyer, this is how much you need a cashier's check for, this is how much you need to do a wire transfer for, because this is the total amount of cash that you need to bring to closing. Don't let that language throw you off in the question. You know, if they say the borrower's getting an 80% loan-to-value loan and they'll pay the balance in cash at closing, you don't need to calculate the balance in cash because that's what you're doing anyway, right? That bottom line number that you're trying to get to at the end is going to include the balance, the closing costs, the taxes, the whole shebang. It's all rolled into one big number that comes out at the end. Does that make sense? And the other thing to remember here is, it would be really stupid to sit there and pass money back and forth across the table, right? Oh, I owe you this, and you owe me that, and here's this, and here's that. We're doing it all at one time, right? We're going to figure out all these debits and credits all at one time so we can figure out how much money the buyer needs to bring and how much money the seller gets to what? Walk away with. That's the goal of a closing statement, to ultimately look down at the bottom of that sheet after all those numbers have been poured into that thing and say, Mr. Buyer, you owe us this much money. Mr. Seller, here's the money you get. Is everybody okay with that? Yeah. That's what we're trying to do in this chapter. That's the goal of all this math. All right? So don't forget that as we get into the math part of it. Now, before we get to math, there are a few things that we need to talk about. So we're gonna do the theory part first, and then we're gonna dive into the math. Okay? So you need to know a few laws that you may see test questions on. The first of them is called the Truth in Lending Act. Okay? The Truth in Lending Act is a law that governs making loans. Hence the name. Truth in what? Lending. Truth in Lending Act. So, if we're making a loan, what are we supposed to tell about it? The truth, right? The true costs that are involved with getting that loan. That's the whole goal of this law. This is a federal law. This is not a state law. This is a federal law. Basically, the Truth in Lending Act says that anytime you're making a loan to a consumer, you've got to tell them the true costs associated with making that loan. We've already talked about this to some extent. How many of you remember Regulation Z of the Truth in Lending Act? What does Regulation Z of the Truth in Lending Act say? That if you're doing what with a loan? It relates to doing what with a loan? Advertising it, right? So this is like where I talk about this is the review part, right? I go back to something that we've already talked about, try to tie it in. Regulation Z deals with advertising loans. And it says if you're advertising a loan, you've got to tell everybody the truth about what that loan really looks like. And how many truths do you have to tell somebody about that loan? 4, right? And what were those 4 truths you have to tell somebody about the loan? The rate. The interest rate, the annual percentage rate. The amount financed. The amount they're financing, right? The number of payments and how much each payment is, right? And any finance charges associated. So like origination fees, discount points, all those things would be finance charges, right? So what are those 4 things again? Make sure you got them in your head. What, everybody, number 1, what? The APR, the interest rate. Okay, what's number 2? The amount financed. So how much am I borrowing? Not paying, how much am I borrowing? Now, how much am I paying? Is that also got to be disclosed? Yes, that's the amount of the payments and how many of those payments I'm making, right? So we need to know how much the monthly payment is and how many times we make that monthly payment. And then the last one is going to be the finance charges. So stuff like the origination fees and interest rates. That's Regulation Z of what law? Truth in Lending Act. That's part of the Truth in Lending Act. So, we have to do that when we're doing what with a loan?
Advertising.
Advertising it. Now, here's the kicker. When are we advertising a loan? When we use what?
Figures, like numbers.
When we use trigger terms, and trigger terms are what? Numbers associated specifically with a loan, right? Because like 1,500 square feet is a number, but is that a trigger term?
Right.
No. $150,000 list price. That's a number,
Right.
but is it a trigger term?
No.
No. 100% finance available.
Yes.
Is that a trigger term? Yes, because it's a number that relates to the loan.
Right.
You know, payments as low as $850 a month. Is that a trigger term? Yes, because you'd be making a payment on what? The loan. So it's a number that relates to a loan. Those are trigger terms, and what they trigger are those disclosures, those 4 truths that you have to tell about the loan. Does that make sense? You kind of starting to tie it all together now? So that's the Truth in Lending Act in action. Now, the Truth in Lending Act works hand in hand with another law called RESPA. RESPA stands for Real Estate. That's easy enough to remember. You're in a real estate class, right? Because people always get hung up on what RESPA stands for. I'm like, okay, it's not that complicated. What kind of class are you in? You're in a real estate class, okay? What's another word for closing? Settlement. Procedures, how you do something, and the A always stands for what? Act, right? So you got 3 of them without even knowing the middle, right? The first 2 are the class you're in, real estate. The A is act, right? So the S and the P just stand for settlement procedures. Well, the name of the chapter is closing, right? That's settlement. So RESPA is the law that governs how we handle closings or settlements. Does that make sense for you guys?
Yep.
So RESPA controls what we do at the settlement. So all the stuff we talk about in this chapter is a requirement of RESPA, because RESPA governs how we close these transactions. Are we good with that? Okay. Now these two laws tied together, TILA and RESPA, Truth in Lending Act and the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, are governed by something called the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. Those 2 laws together are governed by the CFPB. The CFPB did not exist prior to the mortgage meltdown financial crisis.
I remember before that, you go to closing, that's when you found out what your interest rate was really going to be.
Exactly, and in many cases, a lot of these disclosures either never got made or got made right at the closing, or that sort of thing. So the CFPB was created by Congress after, some of you may have heard of like the Dodd-Frank Act. You may hear that sometimes as a political football that gets kicked around on television a lot. Well, the Dodd-Frank Act was a response to the mortgage meltdown. It was, Congress trying to rein in the practices that, you all remember that video I showed you where the lady had a loan where her mortgage payment was more than her whole income because they were using her dead husband's income, right, to qualify her for the loan. These laws are they're geared to try to rein in that sort of thing, to try to pull back on that sort of thing, right? That's why we have the Truth in Lending Act and RESPA governed by the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. So, if you saw a test question, all of that to get you to a test question. Who does the CFPB govern? Who are they policing? Lenders. Exactly, not borrowers, not real estate brokers, but lenders. Now that doesn't mean that we as brokers don't have to know what the rules are of TILA and RESPA. We do. Because we have to make sure that we don't run afoul of those rules. Because you start getting into TILA and RESPA territory, you actually become a lender, right? Because you're subject to the lender rules. Is everybody good with that? All right, so this is what is required of all lenders when you start talking about RESPA. So the first thing we need to know is, when is RESPA going to be enforced? That's the first bullet point up here. It says RESPA is in play anytime we're making or dealing with a federally related loan. Now, we got to go back to chapter 15. Think for a second. What do you think it means when we say a federally related loan? It means any loan that the federal government has any relationship to. Think long and hard about chapter 15, that secondary mortgage market. Who buys most of the loans in the secondary mortgage market? Fannie Mae, right? What does Fannie Mae stand for? FNMA, the Federal National Mortgage Association. Federally related loans. The Federal National Mortgage Association buys almost all loans, right? So what loans are going to be federally related? All of them. All of them, because all of them eventually have the ability to be sold where? The secondary market, which is dominated by Fannie Mae. And remember, Fannie Mae can borrow money directly from where? The federal government to buy those loans. So if ultimately taxpayer money can be used to purchase that loan, it's going to be called a federally related loan. Does that make sense for you guys? So I say all of that just so you can see the tie. How the federal government can tell a bank to make a loan is because ultimately it may be the federal government's money used to do what? To purchase that loan in the secondary mortgage market. That's what makes these loans federally related, even though you're borrowing the money from Bank of America. Does everybody follow that? Okay. So now that we're clear that they're all federally related loans, we know RESPA is in effect for all of them. And RESPA requires two things that you could potentially be tested on. A beginning and an end. All right? So let's not think about it as a loan question for a second. Let me ask you a real-world common sense question. When you hire a service provider to do something for you, whether it be to fix your car or do work on your house, what do you always ask them for before you agree to let them do the work? An estimate of what it's going to cost to do the work. Does that make sense? And at the end, when they send you an invoice, what do you do with that invoice? You compare it back to the estimate. Loans work exactly the same way because RESPA says they have to work this way. So RESPA requires that within 3 days after you first apply for the loan, so you pick up the phone, you go on the computer, you go into the bank, you go see Pat, you go do any of those things with a mortgage broker or a mortgage banker, you apply for a mortgage loan because you want to do what? You want to buy a house, you want to qualify, you want to see, maybe you haven't even picked out a house, you just want to see if you qualify for the loan, right? But from the time you submit that application, because that's really what it is when you're filling out that information, right? You're applying for a loan. From the time you submit a loan application, the clock starts to tick. Because RESPA starts that clock. And that clock runs for how long?
3 days.
3 days. Within 3 banking days after you apply for that mortgage, RESPA says that lender has to give you an estimate of what that loan is going to look like. What do you think those kinds, just, off the top of your head, what kinds of things do you think that loan estimate's going to have to cover? I'll give you a hint. 4 of them. What kinds of things do you think that loan estimate has to cover? Interest rate, the APR, right? The amount financed, how much am I borrowing? What? How much the payment's going to be and how many payments I'm going to make. And then what else? Fees. Any fees or finance charges that are going to be associated with that loan. There's actually some additional information. You have to tell you whether it's going to be an adjustable rate mortgage or a fixed rate mortgage and all. But pretty much, it always goes back to that same core information. You have to estimate, this is what your loan would look like. This is the loan you've applied for. Does that make sense for everybody? And then, that's the beginning. We said when you got your car worked on, you get an estimate at the beginning and you do what with it at the end? You compare the invoice, the bill, to what you were estimated. We do the exact same thing with a loan. The closing statement is the invoice. That's the bill that comes at the end. And RESPA says the borrower needs time to look at that bill before they're expected to pay it. How much time do they need to look at the bill before they're expected to pay it?
3 days.
3 banking days. So, you got to get the bill, aka the closing statement, at least how many days before we actually go to closing? 3 banking days. Everybody good on that? So, you got 3 banking days after what to get the loan estimate? After application, and you got 3 banking days before what? Closing to get this. Why do you think the 3 banking days before closing? So the borrower has time to do what? To, number 1, get the money. Number 2, go back and check to make sure they're being charged the right amounts, that their estimate matches up with their actual charges. Does that make sense for you guys? That's the idea.
Does it usually match up?
It does usually match up for the most part. One of the interesting dynamics that's come out of this, and this won't be tested, so you can kind of turn that part of your brain off for a second. When they wrote this law, they realized that you couldn't always exactly estimate what these charges are. So what they said is the charges can't increase. Right? So whatever you're estimated, the charges can't increase. So what you actually see most of the time when you get to closing now is that they're not the same. They're actually less than what was estimated. They usually, the lenders, in order, I don't know if you do this or, you know, you have to.
Because we have that cost to cure.
Right, so you don't want to have, because what happens now is if the estimate is too little, that when we get to closing, the lender has to fix that. They have to refund that money. They have to cure.
No, we have to eat it.
And you got to eat it, right? You know, like. And so,
I mean, I don't want to take it too far, but when you see a real loan estimate, I mean, a real closing disclosure, everything falls into buckets. We have different tolerance
Right.
limits. If it's something we're charging, 0 tolerance. If I say it's $750, it has to be $750. If it comes
or
in,
less.
or less.
It
If
can be
comes in at
less. It can't be
$751, I
more.
have to eat the dollar.
Right.
And then we have to quote for everybody else: service providers, attorneys, home warranty, home inspection.
So what they do is overestimate.
Oh, yeah.
They overestimate so that when it comes in at the end, they're like, oh my God, look how awesome we are. You know, it's $1,000 less than we said it was going to be.
Oh, yeah.
Because the truth is, if it comes in to be more, then they have to eat that, right? And Pat's
Only
eating
our
ramen
fees.
noodles for the next month because she just lost her commission on that deal, you know. So, yeah. Yes. If you got them last, it's the same one I gave out last week, but if you don't, there you go. All right, so we good on this? Yes.
So they still do like, where it used to be where certain parts had to, never changed from beginning to end.
Right.
And then there was some that were variable.
They
that
have a
could
little
change.
bit of a tolerance, yes, they have
They
the
still have those
tolerance
rules.
buckets, yeah, they still have the, but you guys don't have to know about the tolerance buckets, you know. There are actually 3 different buckets: charges that cannot change,
Right.
charges that cannot increase at all,
So we
and
still
charges that cannot increase by more than 10%. And then there's actually one that says charges that can change, where, you know, like they just estimated this and it could be anything you want it to be. But yeah, you guys don't have to worry about the tolerance buckets, thank God. You just need to know that basically we have to give an estimate no more than 3 days after they apply for the loan, and then we have to give them a final accounting no less than 3 days before closing. And that's a wonderful thing. I can tell you, as somebody who's been in this business a long time, it was very common in the past to not see a closing statement until the day of closing. Sometimes until the minutes before closing. I mean, I used to have to be on the phone sometimes with my buyer who was standing at the counter at their bank, waiting for me to tell them how much of a check they needed to bring to closing. And I'm sitting at the attorney's office, and they'd come out and hand me the thing, and I have to literally sit there with my calculator in the attorney's lobby and calculate these charges and verify them and make sure they were accurate, and then tell my client, okay, check needs to be for $78,350.42. And then they would get the check, and then they would run over to closing. And so they never even had a chance to see it before they're getting the check, you know, and it happened all the time because there was no requirement that they get it in advance. And the other bigger concern was, even if they found a mistake, oh, here's a $300 charge that we weren't anticipating, was never estimated. Well, at that point in time, what was their choice? They could either stop the closing, and meanwhile they got all their stuff sitting on a truck in the driveway, you know, or they can just eat it and pay the $300 fee. And so most of them ate it and paid the $300 fee. And so, and I'm not saying it was done intentionally, I'm just saying it was just a factor of they didn't have time to look at it, they didn't have time to figure it out. And so now this does give them some breathing room. It's taken away that sort of mad dash scramble. Of course, there's always the law of unintended consequences. What it also does is sometimes they don't want to wait the 3 days. They're ready to close. Like sometimes the closing's already been delayed a week, and we finally get a closing disclosure, right? And the buyer's like, all right, let's close. And we're like, we gotta wait 3 days. And so there's also the unintended consequences too, where we're literally just sitting around waiting for 3 days to pass where everybody's ready to go. So, all right, are we good on that? Okay. TRID. The only thing you need to know about TRID is that this is the acronym of acronyms. Remember, TILA stands for Truth in Lending Act, right? RESPA stands for Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act. TRID literally stands for TILA, RESPA, Integrated Disclosure. So it is an acronym of acronyms that have been put together. Basically, what the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau did was they took two laws, RESPA and TRID, which had different requirements, and they merged them. So it's one set of requirements, which hopefully is easier to understand for the borrower. I'm not going to say it always is necessarily, but that was the goal. Okay, so these are the integrated disclosures that we use. Good news for you is you don't actually have to look at the disclosure statement. We're not going to use the actual disclosure statement in class. Now, here's stuff that's going to be tested. This slide, this information, the stuff that's on the previous screens you might see, some of it. You know, this you will see. And it will be in the state-specific section because this is very North Carolina state-specific. We are one of the few states that places responsibility for the closing disclosure on the broker's shoulders. We're one of the very few states that expects our licensees to be able to check the math on the closing disclosure. Now, let me say this, and this is absolutely going to be on the test. This is like one of those things that I tell you 100 times and you still miss it, right? Like, what kind of transactions do you use to work on the real estate agent's brochure in? Sales transactions, not all transactions. I hope you hear that in your sleep when you know, because you're going to see it. I mean, I know you're going to see it because it's like so consistently one that people miss. This is another one. You are not responsible for all of the charges on the closing statement. Because the truth is, some of them you can't possibly verify. Like, for example, if the lender says the origination fee is $800, well, then guess what? It's $800. You can't be held responsible for that number because you're not the lender. You're not on the back end of knowing how much the origination fee is supposed to be. Does that make sense? When the closing attorney says the title insurance is $1,580, well, guess what? It's what it is. You can't verify. There's no math you can check. You can't check the math of how much the homeowner's insurance premium is. You just have to take somebody's word that whatever number it says is what it is. Does that make sense for you guys? Now, could you check to see if it's in the wrong column on the closing statement? Sure, but you can't actually verify the number. Now, in addition to that being a test question, where they'll try to trip you up and say the broker's responsible for verifying it, what word are they going to put in there? All. And that makes it completely what? False. It is not true that you're responsible for verifying all of the charges. You're responsible for verifying most of, some of the charges. So let's talk for a second about things you can verify. Think about every number that's on the sales contract. What are the numbers on the sales contract? Remember, because you wrote the sales contract, right? Now, let me point this out. You didn't draft the sales contract. If you see that word on the test, an alarm bell should go off in your head. Brokers do not draft sales contracts because drafting is writing language, which is the practice of what? Law. If you see that word draft, that should be like a red flag, like, hold on a second. They're trying to trip me up here, right? The word draft is a big red flag. What we do is fill in the blanks on pre-printed forms. And we don't draft language even if our client tells us to. If your client says draft this and put it in there, what do? No, you do it. It's your contract, you write whatever the heck you want to write on there. Not me. I can't do that. I'm not an attorney. Is everybody alright with that? But what things do we write into a contract?
Purchase.
Home warranty, yeah. Purchase price, that's the big one. What else?
Concessions.
Seller concessions, like seller paid closing costs, right? If the seller's paying closing costs, we wrote that number in there so we can verify that that number has correctly made it over to the closing statement. What other numbers? Due diligence fee. So let's talk about that due diligence fee, right? Big test item right here. Big. Understanding the due diligence fee. What it is, why it is, what it accomplishes. And I feel like I always have to come back and remind you about it because it's been a while since we talked about the sales contract. Remember, that due diligence fee, that's not general contract law. That is North Carolina specific. So you only are talking about that when you're talking about the North Carolina Realtors specific version of the offer to purchase and contract, right? Not the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. The Commission doesn't give you contracts. Where does that contract come from? The North Carolina Association of Realtors, right? So what is that due diligence fee? First of all, who's it paid by? The buyer. Who's it paid to? The seller. And it is what?
Non-refundable.
Non-refundable. It is an amount of money paid when? When is it paid? As soon as we go under contract, right? As soon as we go under contract, it is paid from the buyer to the seller, and it is what? Non-refundable. If you choose an answer on a test that says they get a refund of a due diligence fee, I'm going to come hit you with my shoe. It's non-refundable. Now, is there some conceivable way it could be refundable? What's the one way? The seller breaches the contract. The only way a seller can breach a contract is pretty much refuse to do what? Refuse to sell, okay? Outside of that, is the due diligence fee refundable? No, it's non-refundable because the buyer bought something with it. They bought what? Time. Time to do what? Not time to inspect. They can inspect, but they bought time to do something important. That's a byproduct. They bought, this is why I gotta dig at you. They bought time to do what? To back out. There it is. That's what they bought time to do. They bought time to terminate. Because the truth is, it don't matter what they do during that time. What they paid for is the right to back out, to cancel, to terminate. For what reason? Any reason. Does anything change that during that due diligence period? No. What if the seller said, we'll agree to everything you've asked for. Now the buyer has to go through with it, don't they? Baloney. No, they don't ever have to go through with it if they're during the due diligence period. They could ask the seller to make $50,000 worth of repairs. And the seller says, absolutely, we'll do whatever you want. Can we repaint the house for you too? Yes, please. And at 4:55 on that due diligence expiration date, what can the buyer still do? Back out and terminate. For what reason? Any reason. Any reason, because that's what they paid for with the due diligence fee. You've got to get that completely cemented in your brain, because they're going to try to throw 1,000 different curveballs at you to talk you out of the fact that the buyer can terminate during the due diligence period. Does that make sense? They paid for the right to terminate. That's why it's non-refundable, because they bought that block of time to walk away. Now, what is refundable during that period of time?
Earnest money.
Earnest money, which also, by the way, is something that we can verify on the closing statement, right? Because it's another amount of money that we put in the sales contract. The earnest money is going to be refundable during the due diligence period. For what reason? Any reason. Doesn't matter. Because what the buyer paid for is the right to walk away for any reason. Will you follow me on that?
So the due diligence, does that mean directly to the seller or is that from the trust?
Tom's question is, the due diligence fees that paid directly to the sellers and put in the trust, the answer is directly to the seller. That is a check written from the buyer to the seller as soon as we go under contract. Seller's money. Spend it. Go on vacation. Do whatever you want to do with it. And the idea is, why wouldn't it be? It's non-refundable, so you may as well go ahead and do what with it? Give it to them.
What if the seller breached?
Then you'd have to sue them for it.
Right.
You'd have to sue them for it. Okay, are we all right with this so far? So during the due diligence period, what's the status of the earnest money? Refundable. For what reason? Any reason. The buyer walks away, they're going to get their earnest money back. Does that make sense for you guys? What happens when we get to 5 o'clock p.m. on the due diligence expiration? There it is. The earnest money, I wouldn't say that. See, that's the tendency. We want to say they can't back out. I wouldn't say that. What changes? What actually changes? The earnest money becomes what? Non-refundable. Can the buyer still back out?
Yeah.
Yes, but now they're in what if they back out?
Breach.
Breach. And does a breach have a penalty?
Yeah.
Yes, breaches always have penalties. Usually you have to sue to figure out what the penalty's going to be, right? You sue for what? Damages. What kind of damages do you sue for? You don't sue for liquidated damages. You sue for compensatory or consequential damages, right? Those are the kind you sue somebody for because you're asking a judge, please decide how much money I'm owed as a result of this breach. Is that the kind of damages we have in that sales contract?
No.
No, we have what kind of damages? Liquidated damages. And this is another big test item right here. What is the key thing about liquidated damages?
You forfeit the right to take them to court.
They keep us where? Out of court. Because the two parties have done what in advance? They've already agreed. See, right there's your review of the standard offer to purchase and contract. That is everything you have to know about that standard offer to purchase and contract. That's probably 5 test questions right there. And if you weren't paying attention, so freaking sorry. Because I'm not going through it again. That's why we review the way we do. When it comes up, when it becomes important, you know? That is a huge part of the test right there. Understanding the specifics of that offer to purchase and contract. When is the due diligence fee refundable? Well, the answer is, it ain't. Right? When is the earnest money refundable? During the due diligence period. When is it non-refundable? After the due. So here's the thing. If you get a test question, about a buyer who terminates using the standard offer to purchase and contract, what's the one thing you're looking for? When they terminated and when the what? Due diligence date is. That's the only thing. They give you this much information. Does it matter? No. The rest of it doesn't matter because all that matters with that particular contract is, are we inside the due diligence period? Because the answer to the question is going to be, what do you do with the earnest money? What do you do with the due diligence fee? And the answer is always going to be, if they terminated during the due diligence period, which one does the buyer get back? Earnest money. Which one do they not get back? Due diligence fee. If they terminate outside of the due diligence period, which one do they get back? Nothing. And the rest of it doesn't matter. You with me on that? Okay. So these are the things you can verify on that closing statement. You can verify the due diligence fee. You can verify the earnest money deposit. You can verify the purchase price. You can verify the property taxes. Haven't we learned how to calculate property taxes? Well, we're also going to learn how to prorate them in this chapter. So you can verify the proration for those kinds of things. But make sure on a test you never answer that you verify all of these expenses, because that's just not true. Okay? Good with that? Now, here's what you're going to learn to set up. 4 columns. You're going to have debits and credits for each party. Buyer credit, buyer debit. Seller credit, seller debit. It doesn't matter, for those of you that are the little OCD perfectionists among us, it doesn't matter what order you put them in, as long as you have debits and credits for each party. Okay? There's no rhyme or reason here. If you like debit first before credit, or if you like credit before debit, it doesn't matter. Because here's how the math's going to work. It's really super complex. We're going to total up the debits for the buyer. We're going to total up the credits for the buyer. And then we're going to subtract them. And And whatever that number is, that's how much money the buyer's got to bring to closing.
Oh, wow, that's so sweet.
Because the credits are pluses and the debits are what? Minuses. You're just going to add them up, subtract, and somebody says, well, which one do I subtract and which one? I don't care. Because you just get a positive number or a negative number, but guess what? You get the same number. And that's the amount of money the buyer's got to bring to closing for your purposes on the test. Now, in the real world, the positive, negative matters. Because in the real world, a negative number means the buyer actually gets cash at closing, you know, versus having to bring it. On the test, they'll never do that to you. On the test, it's always how much money does the buyer have to bring to closing. So you total those two columns up, you do the subtraction, boom, that's how much money the buyer's got to bring to closing. Does that make sense for you guys? Okay. Guess what? Same seller side, same difference. You're going to total up the seller's debits, you can total up the seller's credits, subtract them, and that's how much money the seller's going to walk away from closing with. Here's another word for that: equity. Remember that word, equity?
Right.
At this point, we've always defined it as the difference between what I owe and what it's worth. Well, think about it. A closing statement, isn't that exactly what we're calculating? Because on a closing statement, we're going to pay off the seller's loan, right? So that number at the bottom of the closing statement is equity. So from now on, when you hear that word equity, think of it, okay, well, I'm doing a closing statement for this seller. And that number that comes out at the bottom, that's their equity. Because I've already taken into account what I'm selling it for. And I'm taking into account how much in commission I got to pay. And I'm taking into account the excise taxes. And I'm taking into account paying off their loan. So that number at the bottom is their what? Is their equity. Does that make sense? I think that helps you understand equity. Because it's the amount of cash they would have left once they've done what with the property. Once they sold it and paid off all the debts associated with it. Everybody good with that? Get with it.
So we don't have to worry about, like, for seller's equity when it's, depending on how long they've had the property and how much maintenance they've done with it, to find out the total. We don't have to do that anymore? Okay, great.
Equity is always going to simply be how much cash would they have right now if they sold it.
Too easy.
Right?
Too easy.
Now, equity changes over time when we own a property, right?
Sure.
At purchase, what's our equity?
Value
Value we purchased.
It's not what you paid for it, but what you paid where? Out of your pocket. What your down payment was, right? Your equity when you purchase is your down payment in the property. Your equity when you sell is whatever amount of money you have left over after you pay off everything. Hopefully, your equity when you sell is much greater than your equity when you purchase, right? Because you've done what over time? You've paid down the loan. Would that increase your equity? Yes. You've done. What else might have happened to the property? Well, not tax value, but the value, right? Remember, the value of the property goes up, so the sales price went up, so therefore your equity went up. Does that make sense? What else could you have done to the property over time that would have increased your equity? You could have added on an addition, made improvements to the property. That would increase your equity. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Good.
So when you're figuring your equity to get rid of your PMI, you don't have to take off all the real estate commission and all the fees.
It's just straight up value. Yeah.
So it's a lot higher than.
Yes, it is. It is. Okay? So, does everybody understand how we're setting up these four columns, right?
Yeah.
Now, what this is meant to be is just to show you what columns these things go in. Are they going to be debits? Are they going to be credits? Do they go on the buyer side? Do they go on the seller side? So this is kind of a cheat sheet, these next couple of slides, just to show you where these things go. So, sales price. Notice it's in how many columns?
Two.
Two. Think about it. A debit is we're taking money from somebody. Does anybody have an accounting background? I hope not. I don't have anybody that's taken an accounting class, right? All right, so I'm going to warn you in advance. Good, I hope you sucked at it, because this is exactly the opposite of accounting. This is not the debits and the credits that accountants use. It's actually the exact opposite, right? You know, okay, so accountants are weird people. I'm sorry, they are. They think of a debit as a good thing and a credit as a bad thing. I'm like, that sucks. I don't know what to, you know, but it's very hard for accountants to do this because my mom has an accounting background. And when she took the class, she would literally, like, I heard F-bomb after F-bomb from that chair over there when she was doing these closing statements because I'm like, no, that's a debit. Every time, like she'd have it in the wrong column because her brain was trained in accounting. But for you guys, it's going to be what you naturally think of. A debit is taking money from that person, and a credit is giving money to that person. Okay? So, sales price. Are we taking it away from the buyer, or are we giving it to the buyer? We're taking it away, right? They're paying that money, so we're debiting or charging them for the sales price. And then what are we doing with the sales price? Crediting it to the seller. So we're taking it from the buyer and giving it to the seller. So it's a debit on one side, on the buyer's side, and it's a credit on the other side, right? We're not changing the money from one side of the table to the other. We're simply taking a pile of money from the buyer and doing what? Sliding it over to the seller. Does that make sense? Because this is the way you should think of a closing statement. We're just taking a pile of money and we're shuffling it around, and sometimes we take money out of the pile and sometimes we move it from this side to that side. That's what's going on with this thing. And at the end of the thing, we want to see who has how much in the pile of money. How much money do you owe us? That sort of thing. All right? The due diligence fee. Notice also in how many columns? Two. We have to give the buyer credit for it because they already did what?
Paid it.
They already paid it. It's part of the purchase price, right? And it's part of the purchase price they already paid. So we need to give them credit for having already paid it. Said another way. I got money for deposit. I do. Can I trust you, Donna? Yes. All right. So, let's say we go, I don't know if I can or not. It's on video, right? So, we go under contract to purchase Donna's property. How many bill I have in my pocket? There's a one when you need one. Right? We go under contract to purchase Donna's property. You with me?
Yep.
All right? And I pay her, as soon as we go under contract, a $100 due diligence fee. So, she's got it. It's non-refundable, right? Yeah. It's part of the purchase price, right? Shit, I'll go get it. So, it's part of the purchase price, right? Now, when we get to closing, look at line number 1. I just gave her a credit for the full what? Sales price. So let's say I'm buying her house for $100,000, okay? I've given her $100 when we went under contract. Now, just think of line 1. I just credited her for how much money? $100,000. So how much money does she have in her pile now? $100,100 because she already got the $100, right? So now what do we need to do with it? Take it back because she's got too much money. Does that make sense? And she's going to give it right back to me because I've paid too much money at that point in time, right? I only agreed to pay her how much for the house? $100,000. At that point, I've paid her the $100,000 now at closing plus the $100 that I gave her when we went under contract. So we have to rectify that. Does that make sense? So we debit it from the seller and credit it to the buyer. Everybody with me on that? Okay? That's why it's on both sides. Now, earnest money deposit. Interestingly, how many columns is that one in? Just one. The buyer needs to get credit for it, correct? Because they wrote that check, they paid it in, it's part of the purchase price. Why do we need not take it back from Donna?
Because it's an escrow.
It's an escrow, meaning she never what?
She
never touched it. We can't take it from her because she never got it in the first place. It's sitting in a trust account. Hopefully, at this point, it's sitting in the attorney's trust account, right? Because that's where we need the money to be on closing day. Does that make sense? So that should also tell you what would happen. Assuming the listing firm was holding the earnest money deposit, what should have happened with the earnest money deposit by this point in time?
Should have gone into their escrow.
Not only their escrow account, but now on the day of closing, where should it be?
The attorney's office.
It should be at the attorney's office. So if the listing firm is holding that escrow deposit, what they should have done by the day of closing is written a check out of their trust account into the attorney's trust account so that all the money's there for the closing. Does that make sense? Is everybody with me on that? Okay? So we're going to give credit for the earnest money deposit to the buyer, but we are not going to do anything on the seller side with it. So due diligence fee, how many sides does it go on? 2. It is a credit for the buyer, debit to the seller. Earnest money deposit, how many sides? 1. Whose side? The buyer, and we're going to do what with it? Credit it to them. Are we good with that? Okay, that's how we handle those two. Mortgage loan, credit to the buyer. Their loan that they're taking out. Because think of what the bank is doing. The bank is handing them that money so that they can do what? So they can buy the house. So that's a credit. Remember, I think people think of loans as being a negative thing, but from a closing standpoint, if I wasn't given that money, I wouldn't have the money to buy the house with, right? So from a standpoint between the buyer and the seller, it's a credit to the buyer. Give them credit for their loan. Otherwise, they won't have enough money to pay.
Just for that day.
Just for that day, right? For that one instant, it's a credit. Because basically, think of what the lender's doing. The lender's pretty much walking into the closing and dumping a pile of money in front of the buyer and saying, "Here, now you got money to buy your house with." Right? Everybody good with that? Okay. So the new loan's going to be a credit to the buyer. Commissions. Who generally pays? The seller. So that's going to be on the seller side, debit or credit? Debit. It's a debit to the seller, usually for the full purchase price. I mean, some percentage of the full purchase. It'd be nice if it was the full purchase price. It would kind of disincentivize the seller from participating in that. Excise taxes. Who's going to pay them? The seller. And so it's going to be a debit, right? Now, remind me, how do we calculate excise taxes? Purchase price divided by what? 500. See, if you can't remember that, you need to go back and remind yourself on excise taxes. Excise taxes, the rate is $1 for every $500 of sales price, correct? So there's 2 ways you can do that. You can simply take the purchase price and divide by 500, or you can round the purchase price up to the next 500 and divide by 500. But either way, the key is there's not going to be any change there, right? It's a whole dollar amount, and it's paid by who? The seller. Everybody good on that? So the purchase price used to calculate the excise taxes. The loan expenses. So like things like origination fees, discount points, all those kinds of things. Who's going to pay for that? Who's getting a loan? The buyer. So it's going to be a buyer expense. Origination fees, discount points. Go ahead, Don.
What about down payment for the new loan? Is that going to be considered?
That's going to come out in the wash at the end.
Okay.
You don't have to worry about that.
Oh,
That's going to come
so
out.
that's
That's part
not
of
on
the.
this for
That
our
is
purpose.
not on. That's
Okay.
exactly right.
Okay.
That number that gets washed out at the end is going to include the down payment. We don't have to worry about calculating that. Okay. Everybody good with? Hear the question? Understand it? Good with it? Okay. So origination fees, discount points, all those kinds of things go in that loan expense column as a buyer debit. Property taxes. Now, yes.
On excise tax, when it comes to the state and national exams, will they ever use it as revenue stamps? As a new
So the
terminology?
excise taxes would only show up on the state-specific portion, because that's a North Carolina law.
Gotcha.
Okay? And so they would sometimes refer to it as revenue stamps. Excise taxes and revenue stamps mean the same thing.
Right.
Same thing. Revenue stamps is the antiquated terminology. That's because they used to actually put a stamp on the deed. Every time you paid $500, you gave them $1, they put a stamp on the deed. Now we just call them excise taxes. Okay? Property taxes. Now, before we get into the math of doing property taxes, I want to show you how you're going to prorate property taxes. I want you to get in this habit anytime you prorate something between the two parties. Okay? So prorate just means you're splitting the expense, correct? Okay? So anytime you prorate something between the two parties, you're going to get in the habit of writing 2 statements. And one statement's going to be for the seller, the other statement's going to be for the buyer. The seller is going to be responsible for their portion of the year. The buyer is going to be responsible for their portion of the year. So let's say if we're closing today, what are we, March 11th today? So March 11th closing. And we're prorating property taxes. Do both parties owe property taxes?
Yes.
Yes. So here's what you're going to write. Every single time you do a proration between the two parties, not for other prorations. There's going to be some things that are prorated that are only on one side. This is just for prorations that involve both sides. So what things would be prorated that would involve both sides? Property taxes, what else? Homeowners Association dues, right? Because HOA dues are usually paid monthly, quarterly, yearly, right? And closing in the middle of the month, you gotta split those up. Rent, that's the other one, the third one that most people forget. Rent, if the property's rented, remember rent's probably been paid in advance for the whole month, and we have to prorate that back out and figure out how much rent to give back to the buyer. Make sense? Okay? So when we're prorating between the two parties, here's what you're gonna write down. Seller owes. Tell me the first date this year that the seller owned that property.
January 1st.
Through what date do they own the property?
March 11th.
Buyer owes. March what? 12 through
December 31st.
December when?
31st. 30th.
How many days are in each month?
30.
30, right? December 30th. Right there, the power of writing those two statements is you know exactly how to handle that proration. Because here's what you're going to do on a closing statement. You're going to do the opposite of what happens outside of closing. See, here's the truth. With property taxes, when are they billed? September. So have they been billed yet this year? No. So then what, the next logical question, have they been paid yet? No, they have not been paid yet. Because you can't pay them before they're what? Before they're billed. With me? So what we know about the property taxes in this closing is they have not been paid. Therefore, who's going to pay them later in the year when the bill comes out?
The buyer.
The buyer is. We do the opposite at closing of what happens outside of closing. Who's paying outside of closing? The buyer. So what's the opposite?
Seller.
There's your property tax proration right there. Not only does it tell you who you're charging, but it tells you what period of time you are charging them for. You just circle the one you're doing. You write the two statements, and by the way, this date's always going to be the what? The closing date, right? And this date's always going to be the date after closing. You're going to do the opposite of what happens outside of closing. If the buyer's paying outside of closing, who needs to pay at closing? The seller. And that's why I circled the seller's statement. That's going to be my property tax proration. So what I need to figure out is how much the taxes would be from January what? 1st through March 11th. Now, okay, I figured out how much the seller owes from January 1st through March 11th. What do you think I'm going to do with that money? I'm going to charge it to who? To the seller, because it says seller owes. If I charge it to him, where does it go?
The buyer's credit.
It goes to the buyer.
Buyer's credit. Yep.
It goes to the buyer. Because the buyer's going to do what later in the year?
Take that and pay for it.
They're going to pay the whole bill when the bill comes out. So the seller's got to fund that in advance. The truth is, whoever you charge, you're going to credit the other side. Always. And forever, amen. No matter which one you charge, you credit the other side. And guess what? You credit them for the exact same amount. You don't say, here's what the temptation is. Let me figure out what the buyer side is. Let me figure out what the seller side is. No! You're figuring one side and one side alone. And then that number is going to show up on both sides of the transaction. Yes, ma'am.
So those two numbers are always going to match, and you're never going to go ahead and balance them for the full tax bill amount, correct?
Nope.
All right,
That's right.
and then in the state of North Carolina, are taxes always paid one time a year, or are there any counties where you do it twice?
One.
Thank God.
One time.
Okay.
Yep. So it's much simpler here.
Yes.
Much simpler. Especially in states that have the two times and one's bigger than the other. You know, some states have like differential tax bills, like there's a big one in the winter and a small one in the summer, and yeah, that gets to be really
Yeah,
confusing. You don't have to worry about any of that.
twice.
Yeah.
Okay,
One time.
thank you.
On the day of closing, the seller's paying the tax on that day.
Correct. The seller owns the day of closing. That's why we set it up that way. The seller owns through March 11th, and they can't both own March 11th, so who owns March 12th? The buyer does. You can't have the same date here and here. Doesn't work.
Right, but I mean, in reality, it should be split, you know, because the half they each owned it, but you gotta do one or the other.
That ain't the way we do it. We ain't interested in being fair. We're interested in saying the seller owns the day of closing. That's the way we handle it. I get what you're saying, but that's
Life
what.
isn't fair.
Yeah.
So if the settlement date or the closing date was post September 1st when the bill comes out, then it flips?
Not necessarily. They'd have to tell you it was flipped. Here's the thing, if it's before September, what do you know about the taxes? They're not paid,
They're not
right?
paid, right, correct.
If it's after September, they're gonna have to tell you, have they been paid or not? Because it could be October 15th. We could change this to October 15th. And what if it said, closings on October 15th? So we'll go here, October what?
16.
16th. Taxes have not yet been paid.
Gotcha.
And it would still be this circle right here. Because if the taxes have not yet been paid, who's going to pay them outside of closing? The buyer. So we want to charge the opposite person at closing. If they said closing on October 15th and taxes have already been paid by the seller, what would we do?
Switch.
Then we would circle the buyer side. Taxes have already been paid, then we circle the buyer side. Because if the seller's already paid them, we do the opposite at closing, we charge the buyer. And notice if we're charging the buyer, do what it says, right? You're not just circling it to figure out who to charge, you're circling to figure out when to charge for. This is the period of time that you'd be charging for. Does that make sense?
Sorry.
No,
So
go
when
ahead.
when you're running these numbers and trying to provide some sort of an estimate to your client, do you personally go into the county website to see whether or not the bill is paid?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, are we good here, understanding this? Now, that's why you see two entries here for property taxes, because it could be two cases, right? They either have been paid or they have not been paid. The top line up here is if they have been paid. If they have been paid, you're going to be debiting the buyer, charge the buyer, and crediting the seller. If they haven't been paid, then you're going to be debiting the seller and crediting the buyer. You never debit both of them. This is a debit credit situation. Take it from one, give it to the other. Always. And it's always the same number on both. I will slap you with my shoe. I swear I will. If I walk around and I see you got two different numbers, you debit the seller one number and you credit the buyer another. No. When you do these prorations, whatever you debit one, you do what? You credit the exact same number to the other one. Don't do more work than is necessary here. Don't make it harder than it is. Because what am I doing with the money? I'm taking it from the buyer and doing what? Giving it to the seller. I don't change it on the way there. Just one side of the table to the other. Yeah.
Is there any difference, like, when it comes to new construction, since it hasn't been an actual property on that yet?
There is not. They still just estimate what the property tax bill for the year is and prorate it based on the number of days. Okay? So when we do this proration like this, we're simply going to take the annual tax bill and divide it by 360 because we want to break it down to what? A daily rate. And then we would figure out how many days that we needed to prorate for, and that's going to be our number. Does that make sense? And we're going to do plenty of math examples with it, but I want to make sure you understand the logic of it before we get to the numbers. Because if you don't understand the logic of it, then the numbers are a waste of time. Because the logic's going to be what gets you to the right place with the numbers.
But if they have been paid,
If they have been paid, who
By
paid
the
them out?
seller.
All right, then do the opposite at closing.
so you're gonna
Stop. Stop trying to think so hard. Do the opposite. Who paid outside of closing? You just told me who paid outside of closing.
well, the seller already paid off.
So then do the opposite.
Okay, circle the buyer and then.
Make sure the buyer pays. That's it. Because if the buyer's paying, who are you automatically crediting? The seller. I mean, it's an automatic thing, right? That's the whole point of writing the statements out. You sit there, you write the two statements. Before you even turn that brain on, because this is a killer. Your brain is a killer when you're doing closing statements. This is like just, you know, You just roll through the steps. There's no thinking allowed here when you're doing closing statements. You start thinking, you're going to be in trouble on these things because you start trying to outthink what the closing statement's telling you to do. Well, when you write the two statements down, then you ask yourself, who paid outside of closing, buyer or seller? And then you circle the opposite one. And then you do the exact thing you just circled. If I circle this, am I doing anything with January through October?
No.
No, I'm doing October through December. And who am I charging? The buyer, because it literally says buyer what? Owes, right? And if I'm charging the buyer, then I must be crediting who? The seller. You see what I mean? It's like there's no thinking required in it when you do it that way. All right? We okay with that? Yep, with it.
So, when in the test questions, can they be elaborate, so elaborate that they tell you, okay, you gotta figure out what the property tax is estimated for the year first, and then determine if it hasn't been paid, and then determine that after the fact?
Not in a closing statement question.
Okay,
It
good.
could be in a math question though, a separate math question. They could tell you an annual property tax rate, an assessed tax value, and then say what would the property tax proration be for a March 15th closing. So you'd have to calculate the annual tax bill and then do the proration. They could give you that on a and that's the reason this math is important, because even though you only get one test question where it says calculate how much cash the buyer needs to bring, they could give you several individual math questions that are pieces of this thing. Like interim interest. You're going to have to calculate interim interest on this, but you could also get a test question that's just asking you to calculate interim interest. Okay? So, other examples of fees here. Recording fees. Recording fees are going to go to whoever they say. If it says fee to record the seller's satisfaction of mortgage, who do you think is going to pay for that? The seller. Fee to record the buyer's deed and deed of trust. Who's going to pay for that? The buyer. They'll tell you who's going to pay for those. Attorney's fees. Who does the attorney always represent in North Carolina? The buyer. So the buyer's going to pay for them. Now, with the exception of, you might see it says fee to pay the closing attorney to prepare the deed. Whose job is it to bring a deed to closing? The seller. So who's going to pay to have the deed prepared? The seller would. That's a seller charge. Okay? Homeowner's insurance. Who's buying the house? The buyer. The seller doesn't care if it has insurance on it anymore, so they're certainly not going to pay for any insurance. Title insurance. Whose title are we insuring? The buyers. That's a buyer debit, buyer charge, right? Escrows. If they tell you to escrow taxes and insurance, who are you going to charge for that? The buyer. Here's the thing. Don't think. Again, if they say the buyer has to pay for 1 year of homeowner's insurance, what are you going to do?
Debit the buyer.
You're going to debit the buyer for 1 year of homeowner's insurance. If the next line says that the buyer has to escrow 2 months of homeowner's insurance, what are you going to do? You're going to do another 2 months. You're not going to sit there and say, oh, well, that was 12, so minus 2 is 10. No, right? Just stop. Stop that brain from running. Just stop it. If it says on 2 separate entries, charge them for a year and then charge them for 2 months, then guess what? Charge them for a year and then charge them for 2 months and don't ask why. Just do it. I mean, these are literally going to be, and they're going to be all jumbled up in a paragraph, but here's what you do. You do them one by one and you mark them off. You do this one, you mark it off. Don't skip. I see people doing that. Well, I don't really know how to do this one. I'm going to skip to this one. Guess what? If you can't do one, you're going to get the whole thing wrong. You're wasting your time, right? So you need to do them one by one. If you come to one you don't understand, go to the next question on the test. Just guess, right? Because that's what you're going to be doing ultimately anyhow. If you can't calculate one charge, you can't do the math of the whole thing. That's why I say don't bog yourself down in it. You either get it or you don't with this thing, okay? All right? Then you total them all up. That's what we're going to do. So right now what we're going to do is take a break, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about the individual pieces of math. How do we do a property tax proration? How do we calculate interim interest? And then we're going to start putting it together. Okay? Right. So what are you going to do with this particular question?
Oh, there's a USB thing.
You're going to skip and leave it to the end of the test, because this question is far longer than any other question is. So if you're not
Yeah, I just scan them in. You can do it on your iPhone. Your iPhone, you can scan them and then when so I just scan them and do it here, but you didn't have them.
I was thinking you got this.
But also you guys, what?
Yeah.
You would not look as good on
I don't mind it, which I can.
It's up to you. So you file your reduction class, or you want to do the cost amount, you go to money that we six.